Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Garland. Thanks Riaz for letting me speak to everyone. I've been kind of spending the past 2 months with Angular 2, so that's why I decided to give this talk. And I hope that I don't come across to anyone as an infidel. I love Rails, but I found a lot of interesting things with Angular 2 and how it can fit into Rails, and I just thought I would share those thoughts with you. So first off, I just want to say this is a brief introduction. I'm not going to be doing anything crazy. I'm going to try to explain Angular 2 from an abstract kind of higher order down to more to the specifics, because that's how I finally understood the framework. So some questions that we might all be having is, why do we even need Angular? And there were kind of 3 reasons that I fell across that made sense. One is it's cross-platform. You can develop iOS or Android or progressive web apps as well as the traditional web applications. So you can reuse that code. Has a lot of advantages when it comes to performance. You minimize the amount of calls that you're going to have to make to the server by not having to re-render the pages and do as much front-end stuff on the front end where that should be done. But for me, the ultimate reason that I've come to like Angular is it's just really nice to me as a developer. It helps me understand which problems need to be solved on the front end and which problems should stay in the back end. And I also included some links to some articles with much better explanations and details about the advantages of Angular 2. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be trying to do. API connected to Angular 2 frontend. So I have set up a little Rails API app. So there it is. So if we just open that up, we can just see that, gosh, this is so small, I'm sorry. And let's make that bigger. So anyways, I just have a controller, and in that controller, I'm going to be trying to send out translation objects. And it's just going to be a simple translation from one language into another. And there we go. So this is what we're going to try to pull into our front end. So let's just close it out and let's get started. So in order to start with Angular, you've got to download it with the npm install Angular CLI command. I've already done that. My computer got really hot while I did that, so be sure to prepare for that. Close any extra YouTube videos or whatever. And then you just create the project. Great thing with Angular 2 is it comes with a command line interface similar to Rails, so you can just use ng like you would use Rails. So ng new, give yourself a project name. Go into root, and then you can serve up the app with the ng serve command. So let's go into that app that I've created.
Make the font bigger?
Yeah. There we go. So I'm in my app right now, and if we go look at it, we can see. I've got too many windows open, and it's confused about which Sublime to open. Okay, so now we're in the right Sublime. So if we look at it here, we've got, I'm sorry, I don't know how to make this part bigger here. But anyways, just trust me, there's this folder called the node modules folder. And the node modules folder pretty much contains all of the libraries that Angular 2 can pull from and depends on. So that's in the root directory right in there. And then in the source folder is where you actually have the application itself. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay. But before we get into the code, I just wanted to say a little bit about how I understand Angular 2. And a lot of people say Angular 2 is the component. But for me, I like to even take a step back a little bit more and say it's about the HTML, and Angular 2 takes these HTML snippets. You can write your own HTML tag, and in that HTML tag, you can define custom behavior. So the way I like to think about it is you're just making HTML smarter, which makes a lot of sense, to me at least. So, like I just showed you, the root of the app has this node modules library, and when you're writing your app, you import any of those libraries that you'll need, and there's 3,000 different node modules, but don't let that intimidate you. You're only going to pull the ones that you need. And it all starts in the main.ts folder. TS is for TypeScript. Okay, so let's go into that folder. Let's look at that. Let's look at that file. So there's a couple things that we want to focus on here. The first one is this line here, line 3. This is where we're declaring which platform we want our application to run on. So right now we're going to run it on a web browser, but you could here say I want this to be a mobile app or something like that, as well as the importation of your main app module. And that really is your app. So in these two lines here, in these two import statements here, you're basically saying what I want my app to run on and where can I find it. And down here on line 12, we're basically bootstrapping or putting together that app module, that main app onto for the browser. So that's kind of where it all begins. And let's get back. And then from there, the next step of our application is going to be the app module TS file itself. So we have to go into the app folder, and in there, we'll see the app module. And just a little aside, these import statements are part of the new JavaScript ES6, maybe ES 2015, one of those two that Angular is built upon utilizing TypeScript. And so we don't have to import files directly into our HTML. We can just import them right there when we need them, and it helps kind of clarify things for you. You know where things are needed. So as you can see here in our app module, we are importing a couple of things from that node modules library that I mentioned earlier that we'll need for our app. Forms, HTTP, but the most important one is the app component. So the app component is where our application begins to be seen for the user. Inside of the app component is where we'll put all of our presentation logic, those things that our user is going to see. And then right here we see this ng module that we've imported with this decorator. And this decorator is basically a way of providing metadata about our class, so that when we instantiate an instance of a module, that module will have the behavior that we want, as opposed to just some sort of default. And in here, there's a couple of declarations, imports, providers. This is basically just a way of saying, we want to declare our application. This is coming from the app component. We're importing these libraries from the node modules folder. Providers, this would be if we're needing to use any services to serve out data. And then we're bootstrapping, we're telling our application what to bootstrap, and that's the app component itself. So from there, we get to the app component, and as you can see, we're just kind of following the trail. There's little clues here, and so when we say bootstrap the app component, that's where we're going to go next. In the app component, this is kind of the heart of Angular 2. We have a component class that is going to contain the specific selectors, the template styles for the functionality that we're gonna implement later on. So we can just see how this is working by focusing on this app root selector, and that's the smart HTML tag that I mentioned earlier. And if we look in our index.html, we can see right there, there's our app root selector. And so when Angular sees that app root selector, it loads up that component, and whatever logic we have in that component defined, it will show that in the browser. So right now we have a template, which is the HTML that will be shown. And in that template, we have a property called title that we want to display. And as you can see, in the component, we've defined the title to be app works. So let's see if our app is working. Let's just serve it up real quick. Okay, I think I'm already serving it up. Okay, there it is. So we can see that property is being displayed correctly in our app. So we want to get those translations back from our Rails API. So in order to do that, let's create a translations component. So there's an easy way to do that. We can just use the Angular CLI ng generate component, and we'll call it translations. So when we do that, it's going to give us all those files that we saw earlier, and if we look at them, we can see that we've got our translation component right there. So what we need to do now is we need to make sure that that component is imported into our main module, because our main module is what loads all the components. If we do it right now, our application's not going to pick up on that. So let's just go check real quick and make sure that that is in our app module. And the Angular CLI automatically did this for us, because I've forgotten that 1,000 times, but we're importing it and then we're declaring it as one of the components that we want in our app. So now let's just test and make sure that this component is working by going into our main page, or our main component HTML, and let's just put that decorator. So we'll call it, I think it's called app translations. So we'll just copy that And in here, we'll just see if that is showing up. So there we see we have that translations component hooked up into our main component, and whatever functionality we want in that component will be injected right there. So we've got to work with some data. So our next step is to create a model of this translation data. So let's just let's create that real quick. Let's just make it easier for us. Let's go right here and do translation. Oops. Sorry. I think here. Okay, so we're going to export a class. Let's call that translation. How did I do this before? Okay. And if we see that data that we want modeled in our Rails API, we see that it's kind of got a native value and a target value. So let's just go off of that. And we want that to have a native. And we have to give it a type, which will be string, and a target, which will also be a string. Translation. Everything is so small, I can't see. Okay. Okay, so now we have the yeah, thank you. So now that we have that model, let's see what we got. We have to import that model into the component that we want to use it in, which in this case will be, of course, the translations component. So let's import that translation model from, and that is model. Okay, so that should work. Now we have that model object. Let's see if we can put some data into this component to kind of mock it out. So we'll just do the same thing. Create a new file. We'll call this, actually I'm going to try something different here. I just want to save your time because I think I've already done all this, so yes. Okay, so there's our mock translations file. We're importing that model and we're just putting some data into it. So now let's see if we can put this data into our component. So we'll make sure that our app component is importing that data, and what did we call it? We called it translations. So and that is mock translations. Okay.
Line 2, I think, from this misspelled.
Yeah. Okay, so we're pulling that model data in. Now let's try to put that data into an object in the component so that we can display it. So, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong component here. Okay. So here, I've imported that translations file, and I'm putting that translations data into a translations object. So if we want to look at that, we can go into the HTML file here. We'll just use an Angular directive, which allows us to iterate over our data. And we'll just call that each of those iterations translation. We'll give it a translation native. And then let's also look at the other property, which I believe was target. So if we look at our app now, we should see that data displayed, and that's what we're going to want the data to look like from our Rails backend. So we have that mocked out. We know it's all working. Already presented that. I've added the directive to the HTML and grabbing those property values. So what we need to do now is we need to prepare that service that's going to be talking to Rails. So we'll just follow the Angular CLI. We'll just generate a service, and we'll call that translation service. And we have those files there. Now, one thing I don't think Angular CLI does for us is put it into our module automatically. So we're going to have to go into our app module and import that service here. And translation service. Okay. And then we'll also have to declare this in our providers. It's not a declaration, it's a service, which we'll be putting in our providers there. Okay. So now our app is aware of that service. Now what do we need to do inside of that service? We're going to have to fetch a couple of libraries from Angular core. One of them is the HTTP library, which will allow us to do HTTP service calls. So let's import that. Just call it HTTP. And that's from Angular. I believe that's just HTTP. And we also need to import an RxJS library. This will give us promise capability so that when we call that, we can operate on the promise that it returns. So we'll just import that as well. Okay? So when we're looking at our translation service, we'll see this constructor here, which is a function that will get called when our translation service is instantiated. And when our translation service is instantiated, we want to make sure that we can use this HTTP library. So we're going to import that HTTP library right here. We'll call it HTTP, and it's an instance of HTTP. Okay, so that's preparing our service. Now let's get it to talk to our API. So let's stub out a method here, and we'll just call it get translations. And in there, we're going to want to call the API with that HTTP service method. So we will return an instance of this HTTP. We'll do a get method on that, and we need to get the URL that we want to talk to. So I believe it's translations JSON. Okay. that is the data we want. So we'll just copy that, call that method there. Now, that's not enough in and of itself. We also have to use this map operator. Just think of it kind of as a promise. We want to map the response, and since that response is going to be in JSON, we need to specify that as well. Okay. So now we have this method that's calling our API. Now we need to use this service in our translations component. So in order to do that, let's go over to our translations component and get that service that we just wrote. So we'll do translations service, and that is from, we got to go up a directory, translations, and service. And I'm just going to check real quick. Okay, it's singular. I put an S on there. Okay. So now that we have that, let's also instantiate an instance of that service right here in our constructor, and we'll call it tService. It's an instance of our translation service there. Okay. So since we're not mocking out this data anymore, we can get rid of that. And in this init function, which basically just gets called when this component is initiated, in there, let's call that service and try to get that data. So let me just see my notes here. We imported the service. Did I declare that service as a provider? No, I did not. We also need to declare this service as a provider in this component. Now we have access to it, and we will, I'll just copy this here to put us out of our misery. Okay. I'm just going to have to do this.
We're missing an I provider up there.
Yes. Yes. If you use Visual Studio Code, it helps you with all this. I wanted to, masochist. So tService, and how did I do that? I call it get translations, I believe. Let's just double check real quick. Get translation, oh well. Okay, so we also need to subscribe to that response. Since it's asynchronous, subscribe, and to that response we will we'll put it in this translations array right here that we defined. So we're basically saying this response that you're giving us back, I want that response to go and be, I want you to put that into this translations object. Translations. Okay. So let's see this. If we go back to our client, we should see lots of errors, of course. Angular app module usually has no exported member translation service. Okay, let's go look at our translation service. It's complaining. Oh, translation service. That's not good. Let's check that again. Type of translation not assigned to type component. Okay. Well, for the sake of argument, So as you can see here, I pretty much did the same thing. Has the translation, and let's go see if we're getting that data from our API, and it seems that we are. So anyways, I know that was kind of a whirlwind introduction to Angular 2, but I just wanted to tell you guys how you can hook that Rails API up into Angular 2, and from that kind of backbone, you can build off of your front end, however much you so desire. But anyways, that's kind of all I've got. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. I've only been doing this for about 2 months, but anyways, there's my contact information. This is a URL of an application that I've been building. It's an Angular 2 app on top of a Rails API. It's also a translations app, so if you want to check that out, you feel free to. But anyways, that's all I got.
This video has been sponsored by Rieta Incorporated. Learn more today at rietta.com.